A man was denied service at a restaurant. Then the owner walked in. A damp chill hung in the late autumn air as Neil Herrera stepped off the bus, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, tension knotting the muscles in his back. Evening shadows stretched across the sidewalk, merging with neon reflections from passing cars. He'd just arrived in Cedar Grove after a grueling 3-hour bus ride from the city. Although he was no stranger to traveling light, he'd done it often enough in his younger years. Today felt different. The sense of anticipation was heavier, the stakes more personal. Standing under a flickering street lamp, he scanned the small commercial strip, a line of local businesses, each front lit by warm interior lights. It was dinner time, and the rumble of distant conversation drifted through the brisk night. Neil breathed out, seeing his breath cloud in the cold air. He'd chosen Cedar Grove as his next stop for a very particular reason. There was a newly opened restaurant rumored to be quietly rising in culinary circles, known for fusing modern techniques with local tradition. But Neil wasn't just a curious foodie. He had something to prove, or perhaps to disprove. Over the last few months, Neil had found himself jobless and adrift, the victim of a mass layoff at a manufacturing plant. Struggling to get by on savings and small side gigs, he became restless, uncertain of how to rebuild. A chance conversation with a friend who read about this restaurant, a place boasting open hearts, open doors, sparked a notion in Neil that he couldn't let go. The friend said it was co-owned by an old acquaintance of Neil's, though he had no details. Intrigued, Neil had hopped on a bus, telling himself, if it's truly the place they say, maybe I can find both a good meal and a lead on the next chapter of my life. Finding the actual restaurant proved more challenging than he expected. After wandering past darkened storefronts, an antique shop, a pawnbroker's, and a rundown cinema, he finally spotted a sign half covered by a newly planted shrub. The sign read Collins and Avery in an elegant font, with smaller letters underneath, farm-to-table cuisine. Light glowed through its large front window. The decor inside looked chic and modern, clashing somewhat with the modest block of shops around it. Neil paused, adjusting his duffel bag strap, smoothing his slightly rumpled coat. Weariness tugged at him. He worried he was underdressed for such a swanky place. But more than that, an unspoken insecurity gnawed at him. What if this was a mistake? Nevertheless, his stomach rumbled. The bus journey had been long, and he hadn't eaten properly all day. He mustered courage, stepping to the front door. A hostess station was visible inside. Through the window, he glimpsed candlelit tables, well-dressed diners, waiters gliding gracefully with wine bottles. The place was busy, maybe not fully packed, but enough that a hum of conversation filled the air, blending with soft music. He told himself he could afford at least a modest meal. He just wanted to see if this restaurant lived up to its rumored spirit of hospitality. Neil pushed open the door and stepped inside, immediately enveloped by warmth. The hostess, an elegant woman in her mid-20s with a neat bun, looked up from her reservation book, offering a polite smile that froze momentarily upon seeing Neil's worn duffel bag and slightly disheveled appearance. Her eyes flicked quickly from his face to his scuffed shoes. A micro-expression of discomfort flitted across her features before she schooled her face back into professional neutrality. "Good evening," she said with measured politeness. "Do you have a reservation?" Neil shook his head. "I'm afraid not. I was hoping there might be a table available." She consulted her computer screen, lips pursing. "We are quite busy tonight, let me see." Her tone carried a subtle wariness. Maybe it was just him projecting, but Neil sensed she might prefer if he left. He wondered if he looked too ragged after the long journey. She typed on the console. After a moment, she frowned, glancing back at him. "We're nearly at capacity. Could you maybe wait at the bar? I'll see if anything opens." Before he could reply, another couple approached from behind him, wearing stylish coats. The hostess's expression brightened as she greeted them by name, gesturing that their table was ready. They swept past Neil, giving him a passing glance. Neil stepped aside, duffel still in hand. The hostess finished seating them, then turned back to him with a small sigh. "Actually, we don't really have space at the bar either right now. "You might have to wait outside or come back later," she said, not unkindly, but rather dismissively. "We often require reservations, especially on busy nights." Neil's stomach clenched. He glanced around, noticing some tables that seemed empty, perhaps reserved. He swallowed frustration, trying to be patient. "All right, I can wait." "How long might it be?" The hostess hesitated. "It could be an hour, maybe more." "Honestly, sir, if you want a guaranteed seat, you might want to come back tomorrow or make a reservation in advance." The nuance in her voice hinted that she doubted he was serious about dining here. He frowned. "I'm just passing through. If it's possible to get on a wait list, I'd appreciate it." A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. She likely wanted him to leave. But Neil stood firm, and her sense of courtesy wouldn't let her outright dismiss him. So she typed something in her system. "I'll add you to the wait list. Please leave a cell number. We'll text if something opens." Neil shifted uncomfortably. His phone was an older model, currently dead from the bus ride. I can't receive texts right now. My phone battery's gone," he explained. The hostess pressed her lips together. "I see. Then I'm not sure how we'll contact you. Maybe you can return in an hour and see if we have anything. Or if you prefer, you can wait outside." Her smile was thin. "Wait outside," he repeated, brow furrowing. "Isn't there a small bench or seat in the lobby?" He gestured to a corner near the coat rack that looked unoccupied. She glanced that way, then shook her head. "Usually, for the comfort of our guests, we don't encourage loitering in the entrance." She hesitated, eyes flicking to his duffel bag again. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Neil felt his cheeks heating. Part of him wanted to argue that he was a paying customer, or at least planned to be. But the hostess's body language suggested she didn't believe he would spend enough money to justify letting him linger. She likely assumed he was some transient who wandered in, which, ironically, wasn't too far from the truth, though not in the way she imagined. The slight humiliation stung. He considered leaving, but something in him resisted. "All right," he said softly. "I'll step outside, but I do want to eat here." He turned on his heel, pushing the door open, stepping back into the cold. The doors closing behind him felt final, as though the restaurant had decided he didn't belong. He paced near the window, peering at the bustling interior. No immediate sign of a free table. Should he find another place, some cheap diner, maybe? But he had come all this way for a reason, to see if the rumors about the owner's philanthropic ethos were real. Rumors of an owner who championed second chances, who was rumored to have come from humble beginnings. Neil had partly hoped that, if he arrived looking modest, they'd greet him with open arms. Instead, he was left in the cold, literally. The irony wasn't lost on him. Time crawled. 15 minutes felt like an hour. He paced a few shops down, hugging his coat, reading posted menus of other eateries. Most were closed or about to close. Another was a loud sports bar, hardly appealing. The cold wind sank deeper into his bones. He kept glancing at the restaurant's door, hoping the hostess might wave him in for a free table. But the door remained closed. Some new arrivals went in, obviously with reservations or belonging to a wealthier crowd. Neil felt invisible. After another half hour, the hostess stepped out onto the sidewalk, likely to put something in the outside trash. Her eyes landed on him with mild surprise, as though she hadn't expected him to still be there. She offered no comforting words, merely a curt, "We're still full, sorry." She slipped back inside. Neil exhaled, rubbing his arms. This was verging on humiliating. Why was he so determined? A combination of stubbornness and curiosity, perhaps, or pride. He wanted to see how far the restaurant would push him away. Or maybe he dreaded confronting the possibility that the restaurant's famed kindness was just PR talk. Another 15 minutes. Then, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up in front of the restaurant. Neil moved aside as the passenger door opened, revealing a tall man in a tailored suit, stepping onto the curb. He looked about mid-40s, with an athletic build, dark hair flecked with silver. The driver circled to open the trunk, retrieving a small bag. The man nodded thanks, then turned toward the entrance. Neil recognized him from the occasional local news feature, a wealthy businessman named Lorenzo. The man gave Neil a courteous glance. "Good evening," he said, with a subtle nod. Neil, a bit surprised by the politeness, nodded back. As Lorenzo reached the door, it swung open, and the hostess instantly brightened. "Mr. Lorenzo, welcome," she greeted warmly. "We have your usual table reserved." The change in her demeanor was stark. Gone was the dismissive tone. Neil watched them vanish inside, frustration biting at him. He debated just giving up. But then, from behind, another car arrived, a simple sedan. Out stepped a woman in a long coat, accompanied by an older man with a cane. They too approached the entrance. The hostess re-emerged, smiling at the couple. "Good evening, Ms. Clark, Mr. Jacobs. Right this way." The couple smiled politely, stepping inside. Once again, Neil was left out. At that moment, the handle turned from within. The hostess reappeared, glancing at Neil with mild annoyance. She might have been about to say something when, suddenly, another figure approached from a side, crossing the street with purposeful strides. The hostess turned, her expression shifting with recognition. "Oh, sir, you're here," she said, warmth flooding her tone. Neil turned to see who it was. The man looked to be in his 50s, wearing a simple but neatly pressed shirt, a light jacket, and polished shoes. He had a kind face, a bit of silver in his hair. He carried himself with easy confidence. The hostess stepped aside, greeting him with genuine respect. "Welcome, Mr. Avery. Are you here for dinner? I wasn't sure you'd be in tonight." Mr. Avery, the co-owner? Neil's heart quickened. So the rumor was that the owners were Collins and Avery. Maybe he was the Avery half. Neil swallowed. This was the man he'd hoped to encounter. Without thinking, Neil stepped forward, momentarily blocking the hostess. She frowned as though about to scold him for intruding. But Mr. Avery paused, looking at Neil with curiosity. The hostess immediately tried to redirect Avery's attention. "Sir, do you need to check on the back or see the manager? We've had a busy night." Avery raised a hand gently to hush her eyes on Neil. "Hello," he said, polite, but with a note of question. "Can I help you, sir?" The hostess looked anxious, as though worried Neil would cause a scene. But Avery's tone carried genuine warmth. Neil drew a breath. He was torn between shame and relief. I came hoping to get a table, but it seems there wasn't space." His voice trembled slightly. He tried to remain calm, not wanting to accuse anyone. The hostess said it was fully booked. "I've been waiting a while." Avery's brows knitted, glancing at the hostess. "He's on the wait list?" Avery asked gently. The hostess coughed lightly. "Technically, yes, but it's so busy, and he doesn't have a reservation or phone for us to text. I informed him he might have to come back another time. We want to maintain the experience for guests who booked ahead." Avery held her gaze calmly. "Of course. But we do sometimes accommodate walk-ins if tables open, yes." She nodded, looking uneasy. Avery returned his attention to Neil. "Would you still like to dine with us tonight?" Neil nodded, feeling a wave of self-consciousness. He was painfully aware of his worn coat, the duffel bag at his side. "Yes, if possible," he said quietly. "I came a long way." Avery smiled kindly, an expression that immediately set Neil at ease. "We have a small table in the back that's usually kept for staff breaks or last-minute walk-ins. I believe it's free. Come, let's see if it suits you." He gestured for Neil to follow. The hostess's face twisted slightly, but she stepped aside. As Neil walked into the foyer, he felt warmth envelop him again, along with the stares of a few patrons. Avery led him past the main dining area, around a corner to a nook with 3 or 4 smaller tables. One was empty. White linen draped it, a single flickering candle in the center. Avery turned to Neil, voice gentle. "Will this be acceptable, sir?" Neil swallowed, gratitude washing over him. "Yes, it's perfect. Thank you so much." The hostess hovered behind Avery, arms folded. Avery nodded to her. "Could you please bring a menu and water for our guest?" She gave Avery a stiff nod, then disappeared, presumably to fetch the menu. Once alone, Avery turned to Neil, offering a handshake. "I'm Ian Avery, co-owner. I apologize for any inconvenience earlier. We do get busy, but we strive to welcome everyone." Neil grasped his hand, noticing calluses that suggested Avery once did manual work. "Neil Herrera," he introduced himself. "I'm grateful you let me in." Avery waved off the thanks. "No problem. Let me see if our manager is around. Make yourself comfortable." He offered a friendly pat on Neil's shoulder before slipping away. Neil sank into the chair, exhaling relief. The tension of the night slowly receded. Minutes later, the hostess, looking more polite now, returned with a menu, water, and bread basket. "Here you are, sir," she said softly, forcing a smile. "We hope you enjoy your experience." Then she departed. Neil opened the menu, noticing the dishes were indeed high-end, prices reflecting their quality. He had budgeted for at least one decent entree. Maybe he'd skip an appetizer or dessert. He sipped water, trying to let go of residual frustration. The possibility that the hostess might still judge him stung, but he reminded himself that Avery had stepped in. That moral boost made him braver. After a short wait, a waiter introduced himself as Martin, offering to guide Neil through the specials. Martin's tone, while professional, was more subdued than how Neil observed him with better-dressed customers. Perhaps staff gossip traveled fast. But at least Martin was thorough, describing a braised short rib, a seared salmon with citrus glaze, and a vegetarian risotto. Neil chose the short rib, something hearty. He refused the wine list, too expensive, and asked for iced tea. Martin nodded and left. Neil leaned back, reflecting on how precarious the welcome had been. A man was denied service at a restaurant. Then the owner walked in, like some fairy tale moment. But this was real life, with awkward complexities. While waiting, Neil overheard murmured conversations from nearby tables. A middle-aged couple discussed their travels, while a young group laughed about upcoming weddings. Neil realized how seldom he'd relaxed in a nice restaurant lately. Typically, his meals were cheap takeout. The atmosphere here, soft ambient music, candlelit intimacy, made him feel he was in a different world. He wondered about Avery's background. The rumor was that Avery once worked manual labor, built his fortune slowly, and eventually partnered with a culinary prodigy named Collins to open this place. Maybe that explained his willingness to accept Neil's presence. Soon, Martin returned with the short rib plated elegantly, tender meat, creamy mashed potatoes, glazed carrots. The aroma made Neil's mouth water. He thanked Martin, then carefully savored each bite. The flavors were exquisite, the richness of the rib, the tangy sauce, the buttery potatoes. He let out a quiet, appreciative sigh. After the tension and near exclusion, the meal tasted all the more rewarding. He felt a sense of vindication that he wasn't just some bum looking to cause trouble. He was a genuine patron, worthy of good food. Partway through the meal, Avery reappeared, checking on him. "How's everything tasting, Neil?" he asked. Neil grinned. "It's fantastic, truly. The short rib is amazing." Avery beamed. "I'm glad to hear it. If you need anything, just signal Martin or me." Neil nodded, again struck by Avery's genuine warmth. It contrasted sharply with the hostess's suspicion. Did Avery realize how his staff had nearly turned Neil away? Possibly. He guessed Avery had some sense of it, but the man was too polite to mention it directly. As Neil neared the end of his entree, the hostess approached, more contrite. "Would you like dessert or coffee?" she asked softly. Neil, feeling the pinch in his wallet, hesitated. But the short rib had been so gratifying, he decided to treat himself a bit more. "I'll have coffee, thank you. And maybe a small slice of your daily dessert special, if it's not too pricey." The hostess actually smiled, as though relieved he wasn't being difficult. "We have a lovely chocolate mousse cake. It's quite reasonably portioned. I can bring a half slice if you wish." Neil nodded gratefully. That'd be great. He waited, sipping water. In a hush, two men in suits entered the back area, scanning the small tables. One recognized Avery's presence. They greeted him. Neil heard them talk about finances for a possible expansion. Avery excused himself politely, leading them to the bar area. Neil felt curiosity. Expansions, philanthropic efforts, a reputation for inclusivity. The restaurant seemed to be thriving. So what was the hostess's issue? Perhaps in the hectic environment, she simply acted out of prejudice. He shrugged it off, focusing on the positivity of the moment. He was about to enjoy dessert in a place that had once denied him. He felt an odd satisfaction in that. His coffee arrived, steaming and aromatic, followed by the half slice of mousse cake, drizzled with raspberry coulis. Each spoonful was decadent. He closed his eyes, letting the richness melt. For a moment, he felt plain joy. If he could only afford this more often. Meanwhile, staff bustled around, clearing plates from other tables, refilling glasses, and seating new arrivals. The hostess was currently showing a group of 4 to a table near the front. Martin hurried past, carrying a tray of wine glasses. The manager was nowhere in sight, presumably dealing with the front-of-house complexities. As Neil polished off the last spoonful of mousse, a pleasant fullness settled in his belly. He realized he'd nearly forgotten the original impetus for traveling here. He'd hoped to glean if Avery was the same man rumored to have grown up in Neil's old neighborhood. If so, they shared a history, though Neil's memory was hazy. Perhaps another day he'd try to speak more personally with Avery, but tonight it felt enough to have experienced the restaurant's atmosphere and proven that kindness could prevail over initial prejudice. Then it happened. The hostess reappeared, face tight. She glanced at Neil, forcing a smile. "I hope everything was to your liking. Let me bring you the bill." Neil nodded. She left momentarily, then returned with a small leather folder. He opened it. The total was a bit steep, but manageable. He pulled out his wallet, extracting carefully counted cash. He placed it along with a modest tip. The hostess picked it up, quickly scanning it. She frowned slightly, as if verifying that he had, indeed, paid. Then her expression turned polite. "Thank you, sir. Would you like a receipt?" Neil was about to decline politely when, from behind, a voice said, "Actually, put that on my tab." Both Neil and the hostess turned. It was Avery stepping back into the nook, his expression resolute. The hostess blinked. "Mr. Avery?" "But the gentleman has already paid." Avery nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "I see that. I'd like to reimburse him if he'll allow it. And I'd like to comp his meal. I just spoke with the manager about it." The hostess's face reddened slightly. She stammered, "Oh, I didn't realize." Okay." Neil felt flustered. "That's very generous, but you don't have to. The food was worth the cost. I insist I can pay for my own meal." Avery turned to him. "I appreciate that, Neil, but if you don't mind, consider it my apology for the earlier inconvenience. This is not how we want to treat guests." He gestured for the hostess to place the money back on the table. She complied, stepping away. Neil's mind whirled. This was an unexpected turn. He parted his lips to protest, but Avery raised a hand gently. "Please allow me. It's the least we can do. And maybe we can talk for a moment if you have time?" Neil nodded slowly, pocketing his cash. He stood, duffel bag in hand, following Avery to a quieter corner near the bar. The hum of the main dining area still filled the air, but they had relative privacy. Avery turned to face Neil, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I noticed your name is Neil Herrera. I overheard the hostess mention it when she put you on the wait list. Are you from the Glendale region originally?" Neil's heart skipped. "Yes, actually, that's where I grew up. Moved around a bit since." "Why do you ask?" Avery smiled softly. "I grew up there too, though I was older than you by about a decade. My father used to manage a small grocery store off Maple Avenue." Neil blinked. Maple Avenue was exactly where he spent part of his youth. "I remember that store," he said, voice quiet. "Used to get cheap produce there." Avery nodded, a warm nostalgia flickering in his eyes. "Interesting. Anyway, I sense we might share roots." He paused. "Which is why it bothers me all the more that you were turned away tonight. I started this restaurant with my partner, Ms. Collins, to celebrate good food and community warmth. We obviously dropped the ball with you." Neil felt his cheeks warm with a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. It was mostly the hostess. She didn't want me waiting inside, likely assuming I couldn't afford anything. I can see you run a busy place, but it stung. I came a long way, and for a moment, I thought I'd get no dinner at all. Avery's expression turned apologetic. I'm truly sorry. This place is supposed to be a safe, welcoming space for all. I guess old biases creep in sometimes. We're working on staff training, but we're not perfect. I wanted to ensure you left with a better experience. Neil nodded quietly, appreciating the honesty. Thank you. That means a lot. And the meal was delicious. Exceeded expectations. Avery smiled, relieved. Then he hesitated, as though weighing his next words. Look, you mentioned you traveled here. If you're in need of anything, job prospects, or references, maybe we can help. I don't want to pry, but it's not common for folks to show up out of the blue in the evening with a duffel bag, you know? Neil's heart pounded. This was the moment. Should he reveal his entire situation? He inhaled, deciding honesty might open doors. I was laid off. Lost my place. I've been drifting, trying to find stable work. I heard about this restaurant and your approach. Some folks told me you're known for giving second chances, that you might be looking for staff, or that you had philanthropic ties. I wasn't sure if that was rumor or real. So I took a leap, came here hoping maybe I'd find a lead. Avery studied him with sympathy. I see. Well, yes, we do believe in giving folks a chance. We sometimes hire servers or kitchen staff from underprivileged backgrounds, but at the moment, we're fully staffed. Still, I might know a friend who's opening a bistro in a nearby town. He's looking for reliable staff. If that interests you, I can put in a word. And we also have a small foundation that helps with short-term lodging for those seeking to re-establish themselves. Neil's eyes widened, emotion welling up. He hadn't expected such direct support. That would be incredible. I'm no pro chef or anything, but I worked in a diner once. And as for lodging, I'm definitely in need of a stable place while I job hunt. His voice trembled slightly. Avery nodded. All right, let's do this properly. Give me your details, phone, if you have it. We'll get you an appointment with my friend. I can't promise you a job, but I'll recommend you. And about the lodging, we can figure out a short-term arrangement so you're not stuck out in the cold. Neil felt tears threaten. This was more generosity than he'd seen in months. He pressed a hand over his mouth momentarily, collecting himself. Thank you so much, Mr. Avery. I didn't expect you'd help me so directly. You don't even know me. Avery smiled wryly. But I do, in a sense. I remember being on the brink once myself, when I was younger. Someone took a chance on me. I want to pay that forward. Neil could only nod in gratitude. The hostess hovered a short distance away, observing them, her eyes betraying curiosity and mild concern. Possibly she realized that her earlier dismissal had nearly cost the restaurant a chance to demonstrate its core values. Avery beckoned her over. She approached, posture stiff. Yes, Mr. Avery? He introduced them formally. Neil, this is June, our front-of-house hostess. June, Neil is a guest of ours, and also potentially someone we can assist in a philanthropic capacity. I'd like you to please help finalize his dinner checkout, though I've completed it, and also coordinate with the manager to see if we can arrange a ride to the motel we partner with. June's eyes flicked to Neil, surprise evident. But she forced a smile. Yes, sir. Right away. She turned to Neil with subdued politeness. If you'll follow me, I'll help you wrap up. Neil nodded, still in a daze. Avery patted Neil's shoulder once more, nodding encouragement, then headed off to attend to something else. Neil followed June to the hostess stand, where she typed on a tablet. Your meal's been comped, she said quietly, voice contrite. I'm sorry again if things were difficult earlier. Neil exhaled. I appreciate that. No hard feelings. She gave a small nod, printing a zeroed-out receipt. She handed it to him. If you'd like to sign, just for our records. He did so, offering a friendly nod, trying to ease the awkwardness. Then she said, let me call the manager about the lodging arrangement. I wasn't aware Mr. Avery did that. Neil shrugged kindly. Seems it's part of his philanthropic mission. June flicked her eyes away, presumably feeling a pang of guilt for her earlier attitude. She dialed a number on the phone, speaking in hushed tones to the manager, then to someone at a local motel. Moments later, she hung up, turning back to Neil. They have a room available. We can arrange payment through the foundation. If you're ready, I can get someone to drive you. Neil's heart soared. The day had begun with him nearly turned away, and now he was getting a free meal, potential job leads, and a place to sleep. A wave of gratitude swept through him. Thank you, June. Really, that's unbelievably generous. She managed a small, hesitant smile, as though grappling with her internal realization that she'd wrongly judged him. I'm just following Mr. Avery's instructions. But I hope you find success. Let me get the keys and the driver. She signaled a nearby server who had just clocked out, apparently one of the staff who occasionally provided rides for foundation recipients. The server, a young man named Chris, nodded cheerfully. As Neil waited near the door, he felt on the brink of tears. The night had swung from dejection to hope, all because the owner walked in at the right moment. He felt an odd sense of destiny. Overhearing some final tidbits of conversation from the dining room, he realized how easily someone could be cast aside if they looked out of place, how quickly prejudice emerges, but also how a single act of compassion from a person in power could change everything. Chris approached, keys in hand. Ready? Neil nodded, picking up his duffel. He cast one last look around the restaurant. A few diners turned glances his way, probably wondering about the hush, but they continued their meals. Neil felt a pang of humility. He wasn't leaving in shame. He was leaving with renewed faith in kindness. Yes, the night had started with humiliation, but it ended with a sense of belonging. He followed Chris out the door, stepping once more into the crisp night air. The hush of the street felt calmer now, not foreboding. Chris led him to a compact car. Neil climbed in, placing the duffel at his feet. As they pulled away from a curb, Neil gazed at the restaurant's facade shining under the streetlights. He whispered a silent thanks. During the short ride, Chris chatted about how the foundation had helped multiple folks get on their feet. Mr. Avery insists the restaurant's success should feed back into the community. It's not just PR. He truly believes in it. Neil nodded, a lump in his throat. That's amazing, he said softly. People like him are rare. Chris grinned. He's the real deal. He might have a fancy side, but his heart's grounded in his humble beginnings. Anyway, I'm happy to be part of this. Neil listened, letting the reality sink in that his future might be brighter thanks to this generosity. They arrived at a modest motel, its neon sign flickering. Chris walked Neil to the reception desk, explaining the arrangement. The clerk confirmed a single room for a week, courtesy of the foundation. Neil almost gaped. An entire week? That gave him time to shower, rest, and job search properly. He signed the form, thanked Chris profusely, and parted ways with an exchanged handshake. Alone in the motel room, Neil set down his duffel, flicking on the overhead light. The room was simple, stained carpet, a small TV, a worn armchair. But to Neil, it felt like a palace after nights of uncertain lodging. He exhaled, sinking onto the bed. The events of the evening whirled in his mind. The hostess's dismissal, the cold wait outside, the blossoming moment when Avery intervened, the open invitation for assistance. Neil realized how close he'd come to walking away, missing the entire opportunity. Fatigue washed over him. He decided a hot shower was in order, wanting to rinse off the day's tensions. Under the warm spray, he found himself smiling involuntarily. He recalled how it all started with a man was denied service at a restaurant, but ended with the owner walking in and changing everything. It was almost a storybook, yet in the raw, flawed way real life can be. He shut off the water, dried off, changed into clean clothes from his duffel. Tomorrow, he'd reach out for that job lead Avery mentioned, maybe schedule a meet and greet. The thought ignited a cautious optimism. He climbed into bed, heart brimming with a sense of gratitude and renewed purpose. Though the room's heater rattled and the pillows were flat, it was a safe haven, a stepping stone to a better tomorrow. Sleep enveloped him quickly. In the morning, he woke to a pale dawn light creeping through the curtains. He got up, made coffee in the little drip machine by the sink, and sipped it while organizing his thoughts. He needed new clothes, maybe a haircut, a phone charger. But top of the list was contacting Avery's friend. He rummaged in his duffel for a scrap of paper or pen. Realizing he had neither, he decided to find a convenience store. He also recalled that the restaurant didn't open until midday, so meeting Avery or the manager might have to wait until late morning. Still, time was on his side. Stepping onto the motel walkway, he inhaled the crisp air, grateful not to be out in it all night. Over the next few hours, he found a small store that sold cheap flip phones. He used some of his remaining funds to buy one, loaded it with a limited plan. The store also had a discount clothing rack. Neil picked out a slightly better shirt and slacks. It wasn't fancy, but enough to appear more presentable at an interview. He returned to the motel, showered again, and changed. Slowly, a reflection of calm confidence emerged in the mirror. Around midday, he headed back to the restaurant. The staff recognized him, eyes flicking with curiosity. The hostess, June, looked a bit uneasy. He politely asked if Mr. Avery was in. She said he was in the office. She offered to fetch him. Minutes later, Avery appeared in the foyer, flashing a warm grin. "Neil, glad to see you. Sleep okay?" Neil nodded. "Yes, thank you. I was hoping we could talk about that job lead you mentioned. And anything else I can do to move forward." Avery nodded. "Of course. Come with me to the office." He led Neil down a corridor to a small, neat office. Inside sat a desk cluttered with schedules, menus, and philanthropic brochures. Avery closed the door behind them. "So, my friend is opening a new bistro in the next town over, near the waterfront. He's looking for front-of-house staff who are reliable and good with people. You mentioned you worked in a diner. Yes? Do you have any references?" Neil explained his previous experiences, how the diner had closed down. References might be scarce. Avery listened intently, occasionally jotting notes. Then he picked up his phone, calling someone named Jordan. He introduced Neil briefly, gave a glowing recommendation based on Neil's calm demeanor, and arranged a meeting for the next day. After he hung up, Avery turned to Neil. "Jordan's a good guy. If you present yourself well, I'm sure he'll give you a shot. Meanwhile, you can keep lodging at that motel for the rest of the week, courtesy of the foundation. If you land the job, we'll see about bridging you until you get your first paycheck." Neil struggled to express his gratitude. "You have no idea how much this means. I was in a very precarious spot. Thank you, Mr. Avery." Avery waved off the formality. "Ian, please. And you're most welcome. I just ask that, when you're able, you pass kindness along to someone else in need. That's how we keep the chain of good going." Neil nodded firmly. "I promise." Before Neil left, Avery paused, face contemplative. "You know, the incident last night might have been humiliating, but sometimes it reveals to us where our staff training fails. I'm thinking of implementing a formal policy. No one turns away unless we physically have 0 seats. If we're truly full, we at least offer them a seat at the bar or the staff table if it's open. We can't claim to be inclusive otherwise." Neil smiled. "That would be wonderful. And ironically, that staff table gave me the best meal I've had in ages." They shared a laugh, the tension of the previous day replaced by a budding friendship. As Neil exited the office, he walked past the hostess stand. June, noticing him, gave a small, genuine smile this time. "Hi, Neil," she said quietly. "I'm glad things worked out. Sorry again about last night." He returned the smile. "No worries. We all learn from experiences, right?" She nodded, relief in her eyes. Neil left the restaurant feeling lighter. The swirl of events had come full circle. A man was denied service at a restaurant. Then the owner walked in, changing everything. The moral was piercingly clear. Never judge someone by appearance alone, for within each person lies a story, and extending a hand can transform not only their life, but also enrich the place offering that kindness. Neil recognized that a seed of empathy, once planted in adversity, could bloom into lasting change. The next day, Neil traveled to the neighboring town to meet Jordan at the future bistro site. Jordan, a cheerful man in his 60s, walked Neil through the under-construction dining area, explaining the concept, a casual but refined place focusing on local seafood and seasonal produce. They hit it off, discussing Neil's diner experience, his interest in growing within the industry. Jordan admired Neil's honesty about recent struggles, saying, "I like folks who face hardships and keep going." He offered Neil a trial position starting in 2 weeks. Neil accepted gratefully. Returning to Cedar Grove, Neil shared the good news with Avery and the motel clerk, who congratulated him. Avery invited Neil to dine once more at Collins and Avery, but this time as Avery's personal guest to celebrate. Neil hesitated, not wanting more handouts, but Avery insisted, saying it was their tradition to toast new beginnings. So that evening, Neil found himself in the same seat in the back nook, but this time with Avery sitting across from him, ordering a sampling of the chef's new fall menu. The mood was light and full of promise. They shared stories. Avery spoke of how he'd once been a struggling dishwasher, discovered a passion for management, and eventually partnered with Collins, a renowned chef. Neil spoke of his childhood, how his father lost a job, forcing them to move around. The parallels drew them closer. Throughout the meal, the hostess and staff now treated Neil with sincere courtesy, no trace of condescension. The transformation was tangible. As dessert arrived, an apple tart tatin, Avery quietly said, Neil, we rarely get to see the direct impact of small gestures. But in your case, I'm reminded why we must always check our assumptions. If I hadn't walked in last night, we might have missed out on a new friend, as well as an opportunity to help someone whose journey aligns with our values. I'm grateful fate timed it that way. Neil felt tears prick his eyes again. Me too, he whispered. And I'll never forget the lesson. If I end up running a place one day, I'll ensure no one is turned away just because they look out of place. They clinked glasses of sparkling cider, sealing a silent pact. By the time Neil left that night, he carried a content heart, brimming with optimism. The notion of moving forward felt less terrifying now. A stable job awaited, lodging was handled for the short term, and he'd made a friend in Avery whose sincerity was a beacon. In the days that followed, Neil readied himself for the new position. He visited a local thrift store, found better-fitting clothing for server duties, studied bistro etiquette from library books, and brushed up on wine basics, wanting to excel in the new environment. Each day, he'd stop by the restaurant for coffee, exchanging updates with Avery or staff. He noticed how the hostess's demeanor softened whenever new walk-ins arrived, as though she'd learned from her mistake. Sometimes, she even gave Neil a shy smile, as if acknowledging their shared growth. Finally, the day came for Neil to move on, heading to the next town to settle in near Jordan's Bistro. On his last morning at the motel, Avery arrived to give him a parting handshake and a small envelope containing some reference notes for Jordan, plus a little travel money from the foundation. Neil tried to refuse, but Avery insisted gently. Consider it a startup fund for your new life. Pay it back in kindness when you can. Neil nodded, teary-eyed, hugging Avery in gratitude. He departed Cedar Grove, duffel bag slung once more over his shoulder, but this time with a phone that worked, a fresh outfit, a job lined up, and a heart full of hope. On the bus ride, he couldn't help replaying the moment he stood outside the restaurant, nearly walking away in defeat. Fate intervened via the unexpected arrival of the owner. The moral etched itself in his mind. One moment of mercy can reverse an entire downfall. The bus rumbled along, passing fields and small towns. Neil gazed at the horizon, reflection shimmering in the window. He smiled softly, determined to carry forward the generosity he received. Meanwhile, back at Collins and Avery, Avery explained Neil's story to Ms. Collins, praising the man's resilience. They decided to refine their staff policy, launching a short training session on unconscious bias. The hostess, June, participated earnestly. The manager updated the official approach. We do not refuse service to anyone who is respectful. If we're truly full, we offer them a seat at the staff table or direct them kindly to an alternative, but we do not turn them out in the cold. Over time, word spread that Collins and Avery's warm hospitality extended beyond mere marketing. A second restaurant branch eventually opened, staffed partly by individuals from challenging backgrounds, like Neil once was, offering them stable employment and a chance at dignity. Avery's philanthropic mission grew, forging alliances with local nonprofits, funding a community job training program. The motto "Open Hearts, Open Doors" became more than a tagline. It was lived daily by each staff member. Patrons felt that intangible sense of acceptance. For Neil's part, he thrived at Jordan's Bistro. The environment was welcoming, the customers friendly. He soon became a lead server, impressing guests with his genuine care and knowledge. Jordan, a supportive mentor, often told him he had a bright future in hospitality. Occasionally, Neil thought about opening a small cafe or bakery down the line, remembering how Avery's encouragement fueled him. He stayed in touch with Avery, texting updates. Avery always responded with a thumbs up or a supportive comment, delighted at Neil's success. 1 year later, Neil returned to Cedar Grove for a special reason. Collins and Avery was hosting an anniversary event celebrating their philanthropic expansions. Neil received an invite from Avery personally. The restaurant shimmered with festive decor, local press gathered, and a silent auction raised money for more philanthropic causes. Neil arrived wearing a crisp shirt, slacks, hair neatly styled. Entering the building that had once turned him away, he felt a rush of emotion. Staff recognized him, greeting him like an old friend. The hostess, June, approached with a wide smile. "Neil, it's wonderful to see you," she said earnestly, hugging him. He returned the embrace, touched by her sincerity. The transformation was complete. Avery found Neil near the bar, handing him a glass of sparkling cider. "Look at you," Avery teased, eyes gleaming. "You look ready to run this place yourself." Neil laughed. "I've come a long way, thanks to you." They chatted, laughter filling the air. Ms. Collins, co-owner, joined them, exchanging a warm handshake with Neil. She confided that Avery told her everything about last year's fiasco, how Neil's presence had opened their eyes. Neil felt honored, standing with them like an equal. The conversation drifted to future projects, possible expansions, ways to keep bridging social gaps. Everyone chimed in, an air of positivity filling the room. Later, Avery offered a toast to the assembled crowd, staff, donors, community members. He spoke about the restaurant's mission. "We started with a dream to unite people over good food. But we learned that we must also stand up for dignity. We had a lesson last year with a certain guest who almost left empty-handed. That taught us the difference between lip service and true hospitality." He gestured subtly at Neil, eyes crinkling with a hint of mischief. Though he didn't name him publicly, Neil felt tears threaten, recalling the humiliation and how it blossomed into this celebration. "Here's to ensuring no one is denied a seat at our table," Avery concluded, raising his glass. Applause thundered. Neil joined in, heart swelling. He thought a man was denied service at a restaurant. Then the owner walked in and changed his life. But the moral went beyond that. It was about how each of us, in small or large ways, can shift someone's destiny by choosing compassion over prejudice. Neil realized that evening, as the crowd mingled and the restaurant glowed with laughter, that the real victory was not just his personal rescue, but the ongoing transformation of an entire institution's culture. And so, with every passing day, the memory of that night, when Neil stood in the cold, turned away by the hostess, remained a quiet reminder that even a closed door can be reopened by a single, well-timed act of kindness.